when my son looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, the house is in my name now, and I think it's time you figured out your next chapter." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just set down my coffee cup on the kitchen counter I had scrubbed every single morning for 31 years, walked to the guest room, and started folding laundry. That's what I'd always done when something hurt too much to face directly. I found something useful to do with my hands. 3 days later, I was sitting across from a woman named Harriet Voss in a law office downtown, watching her read through a document my son had handed me the night before. And when Harriet looked up over her reading glasses and said, "Where did you get this?" I knew. I knew the way you know when a doctor's face changes mid-examination. Something was very wrong. Or maybe something was about to go very right. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I got there. My name is Loretta, and 64 years of living has taught me that the people most likely to blindside you are the ones you fed, clothed, loved, and drove to soccer practice in the rain. My husband Douglas passed in February, 11 months ago now. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that particular disease tends to be. We had 38 years together, Douglas and I. He was a civil engineer who wore the same brand of khaki pants his entire adult life and made the best Sunday gravy you have ever tasted. He was steady. That's the word I always used for him. The man was steady in a way I didn't fully appreciate until he was gone, and I felt the ground shifting under every step I took. The grief after Douglas died was the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly, like water soaking into wood. I'd find myself standing in the garage, not remembering why I'd walked out there. I'd wake at 3 in the morning and reach for his side of the bed and feel the cold, flat sheet and just lie there staring at the ceiling. Our daughter-in-law, Vanessa, called it the fog. She'd read about it somewhere. She said it helpfully, the way Vanessa said most things, with a gloss of concern that never quite reached her eyes. My son Brendan had always been a good boy, driven, like his father, but without Douglas's patience. He built a career in commercial real estate, married Vanessa 8 years ago, and settled into a life that required a certain level of income to maintain. 2 cars neither of them needed, a gym membership for a gym he hadn't visited since winter, private school discussions for children they didn't yet have. I never said anything about any of it. It wasn't my business. That was their life. What I didn't know in those first foggy months after Douglas died was that it was also starting to become mine. It began with small things. Brendan coming by to check on me and mentioning casually that a house this size was a lot for one person. Vanessa suggesting I'd be happier somewhere with more community, less maintenance, less yard. They brought me a brochure for a place called Sycamore Ridge, a 55 and older community 40 minutes outside the city. The picture showed people doing water aerobics and laughing over board games. It looked like a place you went to wait. I thanked them for thinking of me and put the brochure in the recycling bin. The suggestions kept coming, so did Brendan, more and more frequently, often with Vanessa, often with a reason to be in Douglas's study. Looking for the insurance binder, needing the car registration. Once I found Vanessa in there alone, standing at Douglas's file cabinet with the drawer half open. And when I asked what she was looking for, she smiled and said she'd been searching for a pen. I didn't sleep well that night. I went into the study after they left, and I sat in Douglas's chair, the old leather one he'd had since before we married, and I went through his papers the way you do when you're suddenly not sure what you should have been paying more attention to all along. Douglas had always handled the finances, not because I couldn't, but because he'd set up the system early in our marriage and it worked, and I'd had no reason to question it. I knew we owned the house outright. I knew we had retirement savings and some investments he'd managed carefully over the years. I did not know the full picture. I hadn't needed to. Until now. Tucked inside a manila folder behind his tax returns from 3 years ago, I found an envelope. My name on the front in Douglas's handwriting. That particular combination of print and cursive he'd developed in engineering school and never bothered to change. Inside was a letter, dated 8 months before he died. Loretta, if you're reading this, I'm not there to explain it in person, and I'm sorry for that. I've been meaning to sit down with you and go over everything, but you know how I am. I always thought we had more time. There are things you need to know about what I've left behind, more than you probably think. I've been careful with money our whole marriage, more careful than I ever let on, because I wanted you to be safe no matter what happened to me. The full picture is with Harriet Voss at Voss in Caldwell on 5th. She has instructions to reach out to you after the estate is settled. If she hasn't made contact by the time you find this, go see her yourself. One more thing. Be careful in the weeks after I'm gone. Not with strangers, with family. I hope I'm wrong about what I've been noticing. But I love you too much to leave you without a warning. All my love, always, Douglas. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. Be careful with family. Douglas had always been the understated one. He didn't say things like that unless he meant them precisely. I put the letter in my cardigan pocket and went back to the kitchen. Brendan and Vanessa were coming for dinner on Saturday. I decided I wouldn't say anything yet. I would watch. What I watched over the next few weeks didn't reassure me. Brendan started talking about the house differently. Not as my home, as a property. He mentioned property taxes once, twice, 3 times. He mentioned the cost of upkeep. He brought up a neighbor down the street who'd sold and moved to be closer to her grandchildren and seemed, he said, so much more at peace. He said the word equity like it was something I was sitting on carelessly, like I'd left money on the counter and hadn't noticed. Then one evening in April, 2 months after Douglas passed, Brendan came over without calling first. Vanessa was with him. They sat me down at my own kitchen table the way you sit someone down for a difficult conversation, and Brendan said he had something to show me. He put a document on the table. It was dense with legal language, the kind that blurs together if you're not reading carefully. But at the top I could see my name, Douglas's name, and the words last will and testament. Brendan walked me through it with the patience of someone who has rehearsed. He said Douglas had left the house and the majority of his assets to him, as the sole heir, with a monthly stipend set aside for me. He said Douglas had updated the will 2 years ago and had wanted to spare me the complexity of managing everything alone. He said it gently. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I looked at the document. I looked at Douglas's signature at the bottom. Something was wrong with it. I couldn't have said exactly what. The signature looked right, the notary stamp looked official, but something in the back of my mind was pulling at me the way a loose thread pulls at a sweater. Douglas had shown me his will years ago. He'd sat me down at that same kitchen table and walked me through exactly what he'd planned and why, and this wasn't it. I told Brendan I needed time to think. He nodded, like that was reasonable. Vanessa said there was no rush, that they just wanted me to have peace of mind. Then she mentioned a townhouse in a nice area, very manageable, close to the grocery store. She said they'd already looked into it. After they left, I stood at the kitchen sink and felt something I hadn't felt since those early days after the diagnosis, completely alone. But then I put my hand in my cardigan pocket and felt the edge of Douglas's letter. Go see Harriet Voss. The next morning I called Voss and Caldwell and made an appointment. Harriet Voss was a compact woman in her early 70s with silver hair cut close and the kind of calm that comes from having seen a great deal. She stood when I entered her office and shook my hand with both of hers and said she was glad I'd come. She said she'd been trying to reach me for weeks, but the number on file had been going to voicemail. The number on file was Douglas's old cell phone. Brendan had asked to hold on to it after the funeral to transfer some contacts. I had forgotten about it entirely. I handed her the document Brendan had given me. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, and then she set it down and opened a file on her desk. Mrs. Aldridge, she said, and I noted she used my name the way a doctor does when they're being careful. This is not the will Douglas filed with my office. The room seemed to tilt slightly. She opened the folder and showed me the document inside. Douglas's real will, witnessed and notarized, dated 14 months before his death. She read me the relevant sections in a steady voice. The house was mine, free and clear. 70% of all assets and investments, a figure that made me reach for the arm of my chair, were left to me directly. The remainder went to Brendan, held in trust with conditions attached. I asked what conditions. Harriet looked at me over her glasses. The trust specifies that Brendan's inheritance is contingent on his demonstrated care and respect for you following Douglas's death. There's a 6-month review period with specific provisions. She paused. If he failed to meet those conditions, his portion reverts to you. I heard myself ask how much we were talking about. She told me. I had to ask her to repeat it. Douglas had been careful with money his entire adult life. What I hadn't understood was how careful. 38 years of disciplined saving, smart investing, real estate he'd purchased and held quietly, a pension he'd maximized while I wasn't paying attention. The number Harriet said was not the number I had been imagining when I thought about our financial life. It was considerably larger. And with the contingency clause triggered by what Brendan had done in the past 2 months, all of it was mine. What Brendan showed you, Harriet said, appears to be a forgery. The signature's close but not exact. Douglas had a very specific way of writing the D in his name. This document uses a printed D. All of Douglas's signatures used a looped one. She slid both pages toward me side by side. I'd like to contact an attorney who specializes in estate fraud with your permission. I thought about Brendan at my kitchen table, patient and rehearsed. I thought about Vanessa in Douglas's study with the file cabinet drawer open. I thought about the brochure for Sycamore Ridge in the recycling bin. I told Harriet to make the call. What followed happened faster than I would have expected. Harriet's colleague, an attorney named Foster Webb who had worked estate fraud cases for 20 years, moved quickly. He confirmed within 48 hours that the document Brendan had shown me was fraudulent, created on professional-grade software with a forged signature and a notary stamp that traced back to a man who turned out to be a college friend of Brendan's who ran a small print shop out in Millbrook County. The real will was filed, authenticated, and presented to the probate court. Every account Douglas had left, which Brendan had quietly begun the process of transferring to himself, using power of attorney paperwork he'd had me sign in what he'd called a routine administrative matter 3 weeks after the funeral, was frozen, pending investigation. I found this out on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in Harriet's office, drinking the worst coffee I'd ever tasted and feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Clear. Brendan called at 6:15 that evening. I was home by then, sitting in Douglas's leather chair with the lamp on and the TV off. Mom. His voice was different. The patience was gone. The bank called. Something's wrong with Dad's accounts. They're saying there's a hold. I know, I said. Silence. Mom, I think there's been some kind of mix-up with Dad's paperwork. We should sit down and talk through this. We can talk, I said, through our attorneys. Another silence. Longer this time, then Vanessa's voice in the background, urgent and low, and the sound of Brendan moving to another room. What do you do? He asked, and the patience was entirely gone now. I went to see Harriet Voss, I said, like your father told me to. I heard him pull in a breath. Mom, you don't understand the situation. Dad's estate is more complicated than you know. There are things Harriet doesn't have the full picture on. We were trying to manage everything in a way that protected you. Brendan. I said his name quietly. Not sharply, just quietly. You forged your father's will. You had me sign over power of attorney under false pretenses. You started transferring money that wasn't yours to take. And then you sat at my kitchen table and told me gently that your father had wanted this. Nothing. He didn't want this, I said. He wrote me a letter 8 months before he died, telling me to be careful, with family. I didn't understand it when I found it. I do now. His voice, when it came back, had something new in it. Not anger. Something worse than anger. Desperation. Mom, please, just come talk to us before this goes any further. Vanessa and I can explain everything. We can work this out. Foster Webb will be in contact, I said. Good night, Brendan. I hung up and sat in the quiet for a long time. The next 2 months were not easy ones. There was nothing clean or satisfying about watching my son's life unravel in a courthouse. He and Vanessa hired an attorney who tried several angles, that I had misunderstood the document, that Brendan had believed it to be a legitimate earlier version of the will, that Douglas had expressed alternate wishes verbally that hadn't been recorded. None of it held. The notary from Millbrook County had already given a statement to avoid prosecution. The print shop records were subpoenaed. Brendan's banking activity from the weeks after the funeral told its own story. In the end, Brendan accepted a plea agreement, restitution in full, 18 months of probation, Community service, no prison time, which Foster had negotiated in part because of his otherwise clean record, and in part, I suspect, because I had asked for it, not out of softness. Out of practicality, Brendan behind bars helped no one, including me. Vanessa filed for divorce 3 weeks after the plea agreement was signed. I was not surprised. I still lived in my house. That part, at least, was never in question. What was harder to sort out was the rest of it. I spent a lot of years being the kind of woman who filled in the spaces around other people. Douglas's career, Brendan's childhood, the house, the dinners, the maintenance calls, the appointments, the birthday cards sent on behalf of both of us. I was good at all of it. I was efficient and organized and competent at the invisible work that kept everything running. What I was not, it turned out, was particularly sure of who I was when the running was done. After the legal proceedings settled, I had a lot of very quiet evenings in a house that held 38 years of someone else's presence. I moved through it differently than I had before. I rearranged things. Not dramatically. I'm not someone who repaints a wall to process grief. But in small ways. I moved the reading chair from the corner of the bedroom to the window. I cleared out the cabinet above the refrigerator that had held Douglas's collection of novelty coffee mugs and put my good mixing bowls up there instead. I donated the lawn equipment to a neighbor who actually used his lawn and hired a service to take care of mine. I started taking walks in the mornings, not for exercise particularly, just to be outside and moving and away from the phone for an hour. I'd walk down through the older part of the neighborhood, past the houses that had been there since the 50s, and I'd think about Douglas's letter and what it had meant, that he'd seen something coming that I hadn't. He'd known our son, he'd loved our son, and he'd still written that warning. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure I was looking for one. In September, 7 months after Douglas died, I enrolled in a bookkeeping class at the community college, not because I needed the credential, because I'd spent 4 decades not fully understanding our financial life, and I'd decided that was going to change. The class was on Tuesday evenings. I was the oldest person in the room by at least 20 years. The instructor was a young woman named Priya, who wore her hair in a braid over one shoulder and explained compound interest with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely found it interesting. I took notes in a spiral notebook and drank bad vending machine coffee and drove home in the dark feeling, for the first time in months, like I was pointed in a direction I'd chosen myself. Brennan called in October. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was careful and short, saying he hoped I was well and that he was sorry. He didn't ask for anything. He just said he was sorry. I listened to it twice, and then I saved it and didn't call back. Not yet. In November, just before Thanksgiving, the doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw a boy of about 11 standing on my porch in a winter jacket, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight the way kids do when they're not sure if what they're doing is allowed. It was my nephew Eli, my younger sister Patrice's boy. He lived 40 minutes away in Caldwell, and I hadn't seen him since the summer. I opened the door. Ellie. Does your mother know you're here? He scrunched his nose. Kind of. What does kind of mean? She knows I went to the library, he said. I didn't exactly say which library. I brought him in and made him hot chocolate, the real kind, from the stovetop, the way my mother used to make it, and sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited for him to tell me why he'd come. He got there eventually, the way 11-year-olds do, circling around the thing through other things. He told me about a school project. He told me about a disagreement with his best friend. Then he wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at me directly. Grandma Iris talks about you, he said. Grandma Iris was my mother, 81. Still sharp, still living in the house she'd been in for 50 years. She says you went through something really hard and that a lot of people don't know how strong you are. I looked at my nephew for a moment. Your grandmother says that? He nodded. She says Uncle Douglas was a good man and he made sure you'd be okay. He paused. She says sometimes people you love do things that hurt you and you still have to figure out how to carry them. I had a feeling my mother had said quite a bit more than that, and Eli was summarizing with 11-year-old precision. I also had a feeling my mother had sent him here with exactly as much deliberateness as she always did anything. Are you okay? He asked, with the directness only children manage. I'm getting there, I said, which was the most honest answer I had. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made you something. Mom helped a little. I unfolded it. It was a drawing, done in colored pencil, 2 women and a boy sitting at a table, and through the window above them, a man with a smile, floating in a cloud shaped loosely like a heart. For Aunt Loretta, it said in the corner, in handwriting that was half Eli's and half, I suspected, my sisters, from us. I held it together reasonably well right up until I didn't. Eli sat with me while I cried, with the particular graceful awkwardness of someone very young trying to offer comfort. He didn't say anything. He just stayed, which, I've learned, is what comfort actually is. My sister Patrice called an hour later, full of apologies for Eli's unannounced journey, and also not quite apologetic enough for it to be entirely convincing. We talked for a long time, the way we hadn't in months. She asked about the house, and the accounts, and the legal proceedings, and I told her more than I told anyone. She listened without advice until I was done, and then she said, "Come for Thanksgiving." "It's 4 days away," I said. "I know when Thanksgiving is, Loretta." I laughed. It surprised me, the sound of it in my own kitchen. I hadn't heard it in a while. I went. It was Patrice and her husband and Eli and their daughter and my mother, who sat at the head of the table and ate half a plate of turkey and talked for 3 hours about everything except the things that didn't need to be said out loud. After dinner, she took my hand in hers and held it for a moment and said, "Your Douglas was a careful man. That was his way of loving you. You understand that now?" I said I did. She nodded like that was settled. In December, Brendan called again. This time I answered. The conversation was short and careful on both sides. He didn't make excuses. He said he'd been in therapy, court-mandated at first, then chosen, and that he was starting to understand things about himself that he hadn't wanted to look at. He said Douglas had been a man of integrity, and that he had failed to be the same. He said he wasn't asking me to forgive him. He was asking me to know that he understood what he'd done. I told him I appreciated that. I told him I needed more time. He said he understood, and I believed him. We hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for a while, looking out the window at the backyard where Douglas used to sit on summer evenings with a glass of iced tea, reading engineering journals no one else would have found interesting. The yard looked smaller in winter. Everything does. But spring comes. It always does. The following spring, I had the kitchen repainted. A warm off-white, nothing dramatic, just lighter than it had been. I hung a print I'd bought at a local art fair over the table. Abstract, colorful, something Douglas would have said he didn't understand but probably would have liked. I signed up for a basic investing course online and spent Saturday mornings working through it with a cup of real coffee and sometimes the radio on. Harriet Voss had helped me reorganize the estate into a structure I actually understood now. I'd read every document myself before I signed it. I'd ask questions when I didn't understand something. I'd stopped assuming that someone else was better positioned than I was to manage my own life. That turned out to be the real inheritance Douglas had left me, not the accounts, not the house, though I was grateful for both. It was the letter, the warning, the quiet insistence that I had more resources than I knew, if I'd only go find them. I did go find them. It took me longer than it should have, but I found them. Brendan came for Easter, just him, alone, and only because I invited him. We sat at the kitchen table where he had once handed me a forged document and told me, gently, that my husband had wanted this. We ate the ham I'd made and drank coffee and talked about small things for a while, his job, which had changed, the neighborhood, the weather. There were long pauses, and we let them be long. We didn't try to rush past what had happened. You don't rush past something like that. You just learn to sit with it at the same table. Before he left, he stood in the entryway and looked at the print I'd hung over the hallway table, the one of the 2 women and the boy and the man in the cloud that Eli had drawn. "Is that?" "My nephew made it," I said, "in November." He looked at it for a moment. "It's good," he said, which was the most neutral thing he could have said, and therefore probably the most honest. "Yes," I agreed, "it is." After he left, I washed the dishes by hand, the way I preferred to, and looked out the window at the backyard where the first crocuses were coming up through the frost-softened ground. Small and purple, and exactly on schedule, the way spring always is, indifferent to whatever the winter has been. Douglas had planted those crocuses 20 years ago, the fall after we'd moved in. I'd forgotten that till I saw them. He never mentioned it. He never made a point of it. He just planted them, quietly, and trusted that they'd come up. That was his way of doing things. It was starting to be mine, too. I think about Douglas planting those crocuses 20 years ago and never saying a word about it, just doing the quiet thing, trusting the ground to hold what he put into it. That's the image I keep coming back to when I try to make sense of everything that happened this past year. Not the courtroom, not the forged signature, not my son sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a document in his hand and patience in his voice that wasn't really patience at all. What I keep coming back to is a man who planted something in the fall and trusted it would come up in the spring, without needing anyone to witness it. I spent a lot of years assuming that doing right by people was enough, that if you were honest and loyal and present, the people around you would be the same. Brendan's choices showed me that's not how it works. Goodness in a person doesn't automatically produce goodness in the people they raise. Children make their own decisions. Brendan chose what he chose, and no amount of love I'd put into his upbringing could have made that choice for him. That's a hard thing to accept. I'm still accepting it. What I understand now, that I didn't before, is that character isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, deliberately, by the choices you make when something valuable is in front of you, and taking it would be easy. Brendan saw money and a grieving mother, and he made a calculation. What I had to figure out was whether I could make a difference, whether I could sit across from him at Easter and be something other than only angry. I'm not sure I've fully answered that yet, but I'm working on it. That's the most honest thing I can say. Going to see Harriet Voss was the turning point, and I almost didn't do it. There was a version of me that would have stayed in that house, filed the paperwork Brendan handed me, moved into the townhouse Vanessa had looked up, and told myself that this was just how things went. I had spent 4 decades making myself small in quiet ways, and it would have been easy to keep doing it. What stopped me was Douglas's letter. Not the instructions in it, though those mattered, but the fact that he had written it at all, that he had looked at our situation clearly enough to see what might happen, and trusted me enough to think I could handle it if it did. That trust was its own kind of inheritance. It asked something of me. I decided to try to be worth it. The bookkeeping class, the investing course, the conversations with Harriet, where I read every document before I signed, none of that came naturally. I had to push against a very old habit of assuming someone else understood better than I did. What I found on the other side of that habit was not expertise, just clarity. The ability to ask a question without feeling like asking it was an admission of weakness. That turns out to be worth more than I would have guessed. Ely showing up at my door with a drawing and a borrowed afternoon changed something too. He reminded me that connection doesn't wait for the right moment. It takes a bus across town with allowance money and hopes for the best. I want to be more like that, less careful about timing, more willing to just show up. The crocuses came up again this March. Right on schedule, same corner of the yard, same small purple. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at them for a long time. Douglas put those there. He didn't tell me about it. He just believed they'd keep coming back. I think that's what it means to love someone well. You plan things you won't always be around to see. You trust the people you leave behind to notice them, eventually, and to understand what they were for. I'm noticing. I'm learning. That's enough for now.